Ben. Thank you for letting me interview today. I know you're very busy. So I'd just like to give a little bit of introduction, where advances are at the minute.
Yeah, where are we at the minute? We reached our 30,000 membership hurdle, self-imposed hurdle, before we would apply to the Electoral Commission. We did that on, I think, the 7th of September. Oh, no, 6th of September. We applied to the Electoral Commission on the 8th of September. I've had some exchanges with the Electoral Commission, and there's nothing really substantial between us. I'm just waiting to hear from them. But since then, our membership's gone up by over 7,000. Um, the growth in our membership has slowed, which doesn't surprise me because, we all made a big push to get to 30,000 and now it's kind of slowed. And I do think we need to, push that again quite soon. Um, we are getting on with the serious business of creating policies now. Head of policy has been appointed, a chap called David Rhodes, and he is liaising with the various members of the college and other advisors that we've got, setting up policy committees to get that process going. At the same time, we've started our ground game, which is using our 37,000 members to get leaflets out, merchandise out, recruit for the party, get our message out. We're also in the process of organising regional events right across the country. So I'm off to Wales, Manchester. I've been to the Isle of Wight. I've been to Billericay, and we've got lots of others coming up, including events in London. And we're just going to keep growing the party, grow up, establish our policy framework, get registered, grow the party. That's the plan.
Very busy. So I've got some questions on varieties of topics, and what I also
Yeah,
thought was important is that I asked other young people what their concerns are. So I've got a few questions from them at the end.
cool.
Um, so the first point I would like to bring up, no surprise, is the education system. Obviously, there's issues with, biased teachers, name calling from teachers, things that are getting taught in schools which aren't factual, which is indoctrination. So I just want to ask you, what specific actions would you propose to address concerns about ideological bias in educational institutions?
So I think there are two aspects to dealing with that. The first is to repeal all the laws and the regulations which inform us that actually progressive discrimination should take place in our country. We didn't ever have this before. It's all come in the last couple of decades. When I was a young man, it was drilled into me that it didn't matter what your skin color was, where you came from. What mattered was whether or not you had a valid contribution to make to anything, and what it was that you wished to contribute to, and whether you had the skill set required to be able to make that contribution. And we've somehow become a society, not somehow, I know exactly how we've done it. We've regulated our way into it through the Equalities Act and a whole host of regulations which hang off it, which require us to discriminate based on skin color, effectively religious beliefs, sexual preferences, transgender ideology is a big part of it. We've adopted wholesale this notion of critical race theory that if you're white, you're privileged, and if you don't recognize that privilege, you're inherently racist. And this has been going on, as I say, for the last couple of decades or so. And it's found its way into every educational establishment. And not just education, by the way, right across all public sector, private sector, businesses, the the armed forces, the police, everyone is hijacked by this progressive discrimination, which I think is at the heart of the elimination also of freedom of speech. Because if you if you regulate to say that certain people require extra breaks in life, then you have to shut down free speech because it's, in my mind, inherently wrong that anyone should get a break based on their immutable physical or other characteristics, um, and it's likely to be challenged. So freedom of speech at the same time has been shut down. So our educational establishments, which used to be, at least when I was growing up and a young man, the bastion of fierce debate, and no holds barred approach to determining our respective views through that process of debate, um, have now become, as you rightly point out, organizations to indoctrinate based along the lines of this, progressive discrimination. So the first thing that has to be done is repeal all the laws and regulations that have created this landscape and go back to the basics that everyone is equal and it doesn't matter what your skin color is. You be given an opportunity to prove yourself, but then it's down to your merits, your ability to prove yourself. And I think if we do that, we're halfway there. But then the other half comes from ensuring that, the new regulatory framework is then adopted through the universities, because there is a whole cadre of people completely hijacked by this progressive discrimination. And they either need to change their ways or be sacked and replaced by people who will do the right thing. So it's two-phase: deal with the regulations and then deal with eliminating people who stand in the way of equality and
Mhm.
freedom of speech.
Totally agree. Yeah, obviously there's a big problem with, bias in with teachers and things like that. They push their opinions, but if someone disagrees with them, they don't want to hear anything about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really like that answer. Um, the education system as a whole, not just what's taught and things like that, I think needs a whole new it needs reforming. And another point I'd like to bring up is children with special needs in schools. So one of my family members has autism and she couldn't cope in, mainstream school. She struggled a lot. It was very overwhelming for her. She didn't like it. Obviously, there's specialist schools, but it was just fight after fight with the council. The Labour councillors didn't help us. The Tories did a bit more, and we finally got her into a specialist school. But she was out of education for 8 months, because they wouldn't find her a specialist school. So, what would you, propose to address that sort of issue?
But we do need to have special attention for children with, learning difficulties. That too, by the way, was well established when I was growing up. My brother, he didn't have autism, but he had dyslexia, and he went to a special school where children with learning difficulties, including dyslexia, were given special attention. And we've just got to, you know, establish those schools to the extent that they're required to be established. But also, I think, the ability to deal with learning difficulties will also, by the way, I think become much easier if we de-indoctrinize our schools, because they'll go back to actually caring about the child's progression as opposed to driving home their own ideology. And a lot of our ability to deal with special needs children, I think, has been set aside by the long march through the institutions, as I call it. Um, so I think there will be an automatic benefit for children with special needs as a result of debugging the curriculum, debugging the establishment, and removing people who stand against it. But we do obviously need to make sure we've got adequate schooling for children with special needs.
Yeah, I totally agree because, those are the kind of people we should, be spending money on, helping, they deserve as much education as everybody else. And obviously they get pushed to the sides a little bit, which is very personal because it's happened in my family, so.
Think it's critical that every child in this country has an opportunity to at least go through secondary education. I think tertiary education may be a different matter, and I think we've made a mistake in this country pushing everyone towards university, almost stigmatizing it if you don't go to university. I think there's a great deal to be had from primary and secondary education, but then I think some people are better suited to leaving education at that point when they've got a grounding, broad grounding, and they can go forward and actually develop specialist skills outside the educational establishment.
Um, so my next point is on the older generation of this country. Um, my my nana, who she lived with us for 3 months because she couldn't get a home. She was homeless. She's paid into the system all her life. When she was growing up, she was a single mom. She was given the opportunity to either work for less or be given benefits for more. And she worked for less because she thought that sitting on your bum and doing nothing was not the way to go. Um, and the payback she got was basically the council shrugging her off, you don't need this accommodation. She didn't have bathing facilities. The older generation are kind of put on the backbench a little bit. You got what happened with the winter fuel at the start of the Labour government. Um, and you've got asylum seekers who are being given four-star hotels. I think it was about 32,000 that were housed in hotels. So what would you kind of say about the asylum seekers kind of being put on a pedestal and the older generation are kind of just shrugged off to the side?
Yeah, so the older generation um, are being really badly penalized because, in a number of respects, and it comes, I think, largely down to the fact that our economy is going down a plug hole. And, you can look after your elderly, you can look after your vulnerable and those with special needs and so on if the country is wealthy. If the country isn't wealthy, if the country is increasingly getting poorer as we are, GDP per capita is actually reducing at the moment. We've effectively been in a recession for the last 5 or 6 years now on a GDP per capita basis. And I think a large amount of that is due to unbridled immigration, unskilled labor coming into this country, removing the need for wages to rise, removing the need for employers to streamline their processes and become more productive so that they can be more profitable, so that our country is more prosperous, effectively bedding down what I would call third world economics in what used to be a first world country, and then bringing with them all the things that you've just touched on, all the needs that you just touched on, housing. They obviously will need medical care as well, education for their children, making it more difficult for British citizens to get their children into school, burden on the NHS, medical assistance, etc., etc. And this notion that unbridled mass migration can somehow make our country prosperous is so self-evident, it doesn't even need to be examined. It's so self-evidently wrong. And the effect of that has also been that because wages haven't gone up and the successive governments have practiced wealth redistribution, and they've done that by taxing people very highly. Wages have stayed down, taxes have gone up, benefits have gone up. And so people have given up the desire to work and they've gone onto benefits. So we've now got 8 million people on benefits. And the net effect of that is that taxation has had to go up even more. And pensioners, poor pensioners who saved all their lives and got ready to retire, first of all, are now having to retire at a much later stage because they can't make ends meet. So a kind of social contract with the elderly has been broken, that when you reach a certain age, you'll be allowed to retire. They can't do it because the economy is going down a plug hole. They haven't got sufficient earnings to be able to retire. So they're having to work longer and longer. That's the first effect. Then the second effect is those people who have retired, even though they're not being paid much, are actually now paying tax on their pensions because the tax burden has been increased so dramatically on everyone. And what we've got to do is understand the causes of, large dependency, large taxation, dragging people into working longer, dragging people into the tax net. Understand the causes of that and reverse it. And I do think at the heart of it is mass immigration and an overgenerous welfare state. That needs to be cut back. And those people who have worked, those people who have saved, those people who make a contribution to our economy must be rewarded.
We absolutely need to, protect the pensioners of our society because they're the ones that built our
Yeah.
generation, for us. I know you just touched on benefits a little bit there. Um, so the benefit system, how would you ensure that the benefit system supports those in need while also recognising the abuse of the benefit system? Because last year, I think it was £7.4 billion was overpaid due to fraud in the benefit system, which I think is total flaw. It's
Yeah.
insane.
It's insane. And we're spending, I think, Some estimates have it at 10 billion. I think it's more, but about 10 billion a year on foreigners getting benefits. I mean, that's just absolutely crazy. Um, but there is abuse going on, no doubt, Kendall, of our over generous welfare state. As you said, the 7.5 billion. But, there were about 1 million people on universal credit before lockdowns. There are now 8 million people on universal credit, half of whom aren't even looking for a job and are claiming mental health issues. And now, while some of them will definitely have mental health issues and will need the protection and support of the state, actually, I can't believe that we've got 4 million people who, otherwise would have been in the workforce with mental health issues so severe that they can't work. And we've got to exercise some tough love. We've got to make sure that people who can work are forced to work. And I think it comes with two effects. One is reducing the welfare and being more, um, scrutinize more the applications for welfare. So more of a stick approach, but also the carrot that I mentioned of allowing wages to rise, reducing taxation so that there's a real incentive to work. So people go back to work because it's better to work than stay at home. One of the first things, I'm not an apologist for Margaret Thatcher, but one of the first things Margaret Thatcher did, the first thing when she came into government in May 1979, was not to target inflation and control inflation. She knew inflation needed to be controlled, but actually the first thing she did was cut personal tax rates. For the higher rate taxpayer as well as the basic rate taxpayer, because she knew she had to get Britain literally working again. And that's where we're at now. We've got to get Britain working again. So we do need some tough economic medicine.
Hmm. I really like that answer. I totally agree with you. I just want to read this study for my next point. So Ipsos found that 50% of UK adults currently in work believe their job will be affected by AI in the next 12 months, and 64% expect an impact in the next 5 years. So how do you see a future with AI, and do you believe it will lead to, substantial job losses?
So I'm always a bit reluctant. I could be proven wrong because, this is crystal ball gazing, but I've always been reluctant to accept the argument that technological advancement results in people becoming redundant or that our lifestyles are going to get worse. Every generation, every older generation fears technological advancement because they're not familiar with it. And even in the 19th century, when engines came along and uh, other forms of transport were developed and mechanisms to avoid having to, bring hot water up to a bath, you could actually have running hot water. Someone presumably ceased to have to bring buckets up the stairs, and someone's employment was somehow impacted. But for every technological advancement, with it comes productivity increases, and humanity is incredibly imaginative. And with the right stimulus, the right incentives, and the right drivers, mankind will always find good use to put themselves to. But having said that, also, I don't think AI is the panacea people think it is. I think it's going to help streamline the way we work, but we still need humanity. There's, I can be proven to be wrong in due course, but I don't think you can produce a computer that thinks and can act in the way that, a human being can.
Hmm. I ask it because it's one of the things that gets brought up a lot when I have discussions with people in my age, and they always talk about how hard it is to get a job and things, and they actually are fearful of what AI is going to do. That's a big topic among the youth.
But if I were them, I
Um,
wouldn't fear it. I'd embrace it, understand it, use it, and make it their slave, as opposed to allowing AI to cow them into inaction, if you know what I mean.
yeah, totally agree. Um, From the same organisation, Ipsos, a study found that 88% of Brits are concerned about the price they pay for home energy, electricity, gas. So, how would you address lowering energy prices that the British taxpayer gets slapped with?
Well, we've got to ditch net zero. This drive to net zero,
Yeah.
turning our back on our own domestically available fossil fuels, and also then requiring people to unnecessarily over insulate their homes, get rid of their perfectly good gas boilers, get rid of their perfectly good cars and buy really expensive electric cars and buy really expensive heat exchangers. All this drive is highly inflationary and highly damaging to our self-sufficiency in energy. It's also damaging our ability, for example, to produce anything in this country. We're de-industrializing the United Kingdom on the back of this ideological drive towards net zero. So we've got to ditch net zero, and that will automatically bring down energy costs, inflation, and I think the economy will be phenomenally strengthened simply by ditching net zero. It'll take a while to get our fossil fuel industry back on its feet again. It'll take a while for the benefits of all the cost that's been incurred and the regulations that have been put in place to be reversed, for, the net zero regulations to be reversed. It'll take a while for that to come into fruition, but we will almost instantly start feeling the benefits. And then over time, it'll make a huge difference to our economic welfare.
I'm not sure what they're doing with net zero, to be honest, because they all fly in private jets and things like that, so they're a bit
No, it's
hypocritical.
hypocritical.
Um, this question's one of the ones I wanted to ask the most. What is your position on restoring the death penalty?
So it's very easy, I think, to look at what's going on around us, the increasing crime, serious crime, knife crime, burglaries, um, stabbings, all that sort of thing, particularly with illegal migrants being brought, spread right across the country. People who we know to have entered the country, breaking our law, now being welcomed into the country and spread across the country. I think it's very easy to go to a knee-jerk kind of position and go, right, we need more draconian punishment. And um, Robert Peel in the 19th century learned, I think, and it's a lesson we need to keep in mind, that it's not necessarily the severity of the punishment that matters. It's the knowledge that you will be apprehended if you break the law and you will be punished. Um, it's the knowledge that you can't get away with crime that I think is more important than actually the severity of the punishment. And my own view on capital punishment, as a young man, I used to really believe in it. And I was quite, a supporter of capital punishment. As I've got older and I've seen the fact that the failings of humanity, the failing of our ability to actually absolutely always get the right result, I'm reluctant to propose that we go back to that because, you know, taking someone's life is a very, very big step. And we are fallible. We do make mistakes. And I think it was a sign of the advancement in our civilization when we got rid of the death penalty. And I'd be very reluctant to go back to it. As an aside, I'm actually staggered with the assisted dying bill. I don't think it's on the statute books now, but for those people who make the case against the state being able to take your life after a judicial process, in other words, the death penalty, those same people now are prepared to put the elderly and vulnerable to death without even a judicial process through, assisted dying. And I think we need to take a very hard look at ourselves where we're going as a civilization if we're at the one level saying, from a someone who's been through a full judicial process shouldn't be put to death, but someone who's elderly, um, clearly not completely in control of their faculties, can choose to be put to death and just assume that there won't be any malign influences being used in order to, come to that end result. But just going back to your question, I'm reluctant to go back to the death penalty. I would like our criminal justice system to start working on the way it used to work for decades before we started seeing, serious crime going out of control.
hmm I know you mentioned there, like, we can't always get everything right. Like, if there's no evidence, they might be innocent and stuff. We could bring the
Yeah.
wrong person to death. If it was 100%, evidence, they've committed a horrible crime, a mass murder. We know it was them, the CCTV, the caught them in the act. Would you consider it for the more serious crimes?
I mean, this is the great debate, isn't it? And also if they kill someone who's in my family or someone I loved and whatever. Um, there are people in the on this planet. This is, I think, one of the flaws with the notion that all humanity is equal all the time. There are people on this planet who do things which make them vermin, in my mind. Stalin was a good example, Hitler's a good example, other people like that. And you'd have no, I'd have no qualms putting them to death. But when you bring back the death penalty, you're not bringing it back just for one person or for one specific group. You've got to remember that it's the same judiciary that would be making these determinations as the same judiciary, the judiciary that's completely politically biased. We talk about the two-tier criminal justice system, and a lot of people who identify the criminal justice system as being two-tiered, as being politicized, as being broken, are now advocating bringing back the death penalty. Well, we'd be giving these same judges that power. They would be using it potentially against us. Uh, are you with me? So, whilst I completely
Yeah.
agree with the examples you've given to illustrate, there are people who should be put down. Um, I think when you're talking about the death penalty, it's not just the act of putting a particular individual down. Well, one has to remember that you're empowering a judiciary that may misuse that power. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Yeah, would you implement any, like policies or actions to make sure that the judiciary system isn't politically used in that way?
Yeah, so I thought Robert Jenrick made a very good point the other day when he identified 31 judges who had been politically active in supporting charities, for example, that were allowing illegal migrants to get away with coming into this country and staying here, advising them on which parts of the European Convention on Human Rights they should be invoking and how to invoke it to prevent being deported, etc. Those judges need to be fired. We've got to fire them. And one of the big damages done by Tony Blair was the creation of the Supreme Court, in my mind. He separated he called it the separation of powers, removing from Parliament the law lords and creating the Supreme Court. But I think he did huge constitutional damage because in Parliament we had a kind of unified body of people who were there to serve the country, who weren't politicized in the way that a Supreme Court can be politicized. And we've seen repeatedly the Supreme Court now doing things which are self-evidently, politically driven. And
Mm.
uh, if there's a way to get the Supreme Court abolished and the law lords back in the House of Lords, I'd prefer to go in that route. Of course, Advance UK is making its policies at the moment, and this is something that we will be looking at in great detail.
Mhm. Um, so just on kind of on this topic, um, what steps would you kind of take to ensure that that monsters like Axel Rudy Cabana don't slip through the net of the authorities? Obviously there's other examples where, if people had done the job, the tragedies wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, so the organization Prevent that I think identified Rudy Cabana quite early on as being a potential threat, but then ignored it. They themselves are politicized. You know, I, you need to fact check me on this, but there's definitely government guidance which talks about far right terrorism, and it defines far right as being culturally nationalistic, cultural nationalism, white nationalism, or white supremacy. Now, fine, there may be elements of genuine far right in amongst the white supremacists, but I find it very hard to make the argument that cultural nationalism is somehow far right. And so an organization like Prevent, which gets its guidance from the government on what is acceptable, what isn't, and infused, no doubt, it is with progressive discrimination and DEI. We'll probably look at someone like Axel Rudikabana through a prism of sympathy rather than understanding that he poses a genuine threat to, as he proved himself to be, a very, very genuine threat to
Mhm.
law-abiding British citizens. And it goes back to where we started our conversation in a sense. We've got to reacquaint ourselves with the notion that everyone is equal because you can't have equality under the law unless you recognize that everyone is equal. And Ruda Cabana, they skirted around Ruda Cabana because he became an accidental beneficiary of this ridiculous DEI policy, which is infused in Prevent, as I just said. And I hear lots of politicians say, we're going to be tough on crime, we're going to employ another 20,000 police officers. But there's no point in employing another 20,000 police officers if they're hijacked in the same way that Prevent are and our existing constabulary are, and they're all progressively discriminating in favor of ethnic minorities and turning a blind eye to people like Ruda Cabana. There's only any point in having extra police officers if they know what their job is.
Hmm.
Um, one of the things that I think has gone completely wrong again with this sort of notion, with the hijacking by the Human Rights Act, is that we've begun to protect criminals rather than victims. And the rape gangs, I'm sure an element of that comes down to the fact that the way the Human Rights Act is being used by the criminal justice system is to protect the criminals and to somehow make the case completely wrongly that criminals deserve all the same rights as the victims.
Hmm.
And the victims then get thrown under a bus. And, it's only now coming to light how little protection those underage white girls were given. Um, so we've got to go back again fundamentally to what is our criminal justice system? How does it operate? What should be policed? What shouldn't be policed? I don't. There's excessive tweeting, excessive policing going on of tweeting. There shouldn't be any policing of tweeting. People should be allowed, unless there's an incitement to violence, it should be left to people to say whatever the hell they want to say. But if you find someone in possession of ricin, in possession of Al Qaeda workbooks on how to, cause terrorism, they should be blown arrested and chucked in jail. And Ruda Cabana was one such individual. And the full story on Ruda Cabana still hasn't got out. It's still being hushed up. We still don't know why Merseyside police kept his identity secret for so long. Why Yvette Cooper wasn't prepared to say what we then subsequently discovered about him. It's because in my mind, it's because they're committed to this program of mass migration, not caring about British citizenry, hijacked by this notion of, the Human Rights Act, and everyone in the world is all equal, even criminals, even people who broke into this country, even foreigners, everyone gets the same treatment. And British citizens are constantly being thrown under a bus. And we've got to re-educate ourselves, the criminal justice system, the police. They need to know that their primary duty is to the British citizen, to protect British citizens. That's what they're there for.
Just on that point then about the grooming gangs and keeping identity secret and things like that. Obviously thousands of young girls were raped and trafficked, and councils, the police, the authorities, they ignored it for fear of being called racist. So if you were in government, would you publish full ethnicity data on these offenders every year, and would you be transparent with the public?
Absolutely. I mean, I hope that if we've been in government for a while, this sort of thing would absolutely stop, and that there would be no need to publish anything because the activity would have stopped. But we're going to bear down. An advanced UK government will stop illegal migration before the migrants get to our shores. And if they do somehow get to our shores, they will be locked up and they will be deported. It'll be a zero tolerance approach to it. And there'll be a zero tolerance approach to that kind of criminality. Anyone covering it up will face the full force of the law. Absolutely, drive it home.
Um, Knife crime, obviously a big problem in our society at the minute, reaching about 53,000 offences in a year. What targeted actions would you take to reduce this growing threat, as it does take so many lives?
So again, it comes back to, knife crime. It's not the knife committing the crime. I've heard many politicians say we've got to ban sharp knives, and this. Anyone can find a stabbing weapon. I can probably find a stabbing weapon in my office right now if I want to. It's the individual wielding it that needs to be bared down on. And uh, at the risk of repeating myself, Kendall, I think it comes back to all the same things we've just been discussing. Reacquainting ourselves with the protection of making sure that we don't import illegal migrants and criminal elements into our society, bearing down heavily on people who do break the law, making sure our economy is performing well in the way that we described earlier, so that there's less need or less incentive for people to become criminals in the first place. And then once you find these people, if someone does commit a crime, like, that the chap who brutally murdered Wayne, Broadhurst, a couple of days, 3 days ago, they should be absolutely have the book thrown at them. There should be no sympathy. Um, and then we've just got to do that. And we've got to just make everyone aware that if you break the law, you do the crime, you will do the time, and there will be no sympathy.
Um, Given the EU's recent push for 50% tariffs on steel, to shield its industries from Chinese overcapacity, would you support implementing similar, like Trump-style tariffs here in the UK?
Absolutely. Trump has got it. Whether or not the manner in which he's done it is correct. The principle of tariffs is absolutely right. Um, we in this country work to a very high regulatory and taxation standard, ridiculously high. We've got to deregulate and reduce taxes, but we have a very high regulatory standard. And yet, we are doing free trade deals with countries like India, which don't have high regulatory standards, don't protect employees the way we do, buy cheap Russian oil, breaching sanctions in order to do it. We've literally just done a free trade deal with India. That free trade deal is going to allow India to exploit all the advantages it has against us by exporting to us. And I think they're even being given a holiday on national insurance for Indian employees working in Indian companies based in the United Kingdom. So we're giving them tax advantages to come in and effectively take our industry. Because when you have free trade with countries like India and China and so on, which don't operate to the same regulatory framework that we do, what you do is empower them to take our jobs. We go on talking about the need for economic prosperity, leveling up our country. We're not going to achieve it if we export our jobs abroad. We've got to make stuff in this country. We've deindustrialized this country on the back of net zero and free trade. And we are one of the biggest importers. The United Kingdom is one of the biggest importers in the world. We are one of the world's clients. And that's wrong. They've got to start buying our stuff. And unless they buy our stuff, we've got to impose tariffs on them. Unless they uh, adopt our high regulatory burden that we've got and the same taxation system that we've got to impose tariffs on them. And one of the things we should have done when we left the EU was not go for a free trade deal with the EU. We run a massive deficit with the EU. We should have gone for a no holds barred independent trading policy. And if they impose tariffs on us, we impose tariffs on them. The EU needs us much more than we need them. But again, our governing class didn't have the confidence to do what's right for this country. Free trade, whilst in principle, at a basic level, makes sense. When you layer into it all the different regulatory burdens of various countries, the way that they behave versus the way we behave, it's not. It hasn't worked for many, many years. It doesn't work in the basic way that people had hoped it would work. It ceased to do that. Trump is right to impose tariffs, and we should be looking at it as well.
A lot of young people that I speak to and have conversations with about politics, a lot of them have a very negative view of Brexit. They make the argument like the economy's worse, it didn't solve immigration. What would you say to those people?
Well, we didn't Brexit. We didn't leave the EU. There are two aspects to leaving the European Union. The first aspect was leaving the European Court of Justice, leaving their commission, leaving their parliament, leaving their other institutions. We left all of those, but then we signed up to all the same regulatory framework that we had when we were in the EU. So the withdrawal agreement that Boris Johnson signed with the European Union has left Northern Ireland behind, subject to all EU regulations on state aid, competition, um, uh, VAT, excise duty, even human rights law of the EU applies in Northern Ireland. And then he signed another trade agreement with the EU called the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, in which we agreed to abide by their state aid law, their competition law, their employment law, their environmental law. So we weren't able to deregulate. We weren't able to chart a path for the UK, which was good for the UK. And one of the things that really gets me down about Nigel Farage is he says Brexit's done. And then he has the impossible task of defending the hodgepodge garbage that Boris Johnson delivered. The fact is, we never properly left. If we'd left the EU, we would have been able to do what's right for this country. If we'd left the ECHR as well, we would have been able to stop boats in the channel. If we'd left the EU, we would have been able to cut taxes, ditch net zero, support British businesses, etc., etc., etc. But we never did it. And so to the people who say Brexit didn't work, I say we never got it. And we genuinely never got it, Kendall. We never got it.
Mhm.
The political class still stands in opposition to it. And people like Farage should call it out. They don't.
Well, when people bring up Brexit to me, I always say we're still in the ECHR. We're limited on what we can do. We're still, we're not
Absolutely.
independent still. Um, so people also have a negative view on leaving the ECHR. You're taking away human rights. What's your argument for that?
Well, I think in this conversation that we've had so far, a number of times we've bumped up against the European Convention on Human Rights in the way that it's preventing us from looking after our citizenry. It's preventing us from being able to stop criminality coming into the country illegally. It's preventing us from understanding the difference between a criminal and a victim. Uh, these are three fundamental things where the Human Rights Act is actually defeating its very purpose. Um, no, the Human Rights Act, which is the embodiment of the European Convention on Human Rights in British law, is all wrong. We have to get rid of it. We have to leave the ECHR. We have to leave it. The notion that we need to be part of it to understand what human rights is in this country is absolute nonsense. We established human rights way before the Europeans understood it. The Europeans, relative to the United Kingdom, are barbaric. It wasn't the UK that started World War II. It wasn't the UK that created all those concentration camps and everything. It was Europeans that did it. And if you look at the European empires of the past, they're brutal. The British Empire was not a brutal empire. The Dutch, the Belgians, they were brutal when they went abroad in a way that we were never brutal. And so the European Convention was actually established by us to police them, to make sure that we didn't have another World War II kind of outcome. We don't need to be part of the ECHR. We had a perfectly good body of law that protected human rights in this country. The European Convention on Human Rights, the HRA, the Human Rights Act, has served to undermine our ability actually to preserve human rights and the rights of British citizens in this country.
Um, Obviously, one big thing for me is when, I talk about politics a lot, all the time, wherever I go, I'm talking about politics. Some people don't know the name of the Prime Minister, very uneducated. And I think politics is important. I think it affects everybody. Once you start getting bills, it's going to affect you, whether you like it or not. So what steps would you take to, inspire and empower young people into the world of politics?
Well, I think one of the worst things that our political class has done is repeatedly make promises and say they're going to do things and then not do them. They are completely out of touch with the electorate. And we've seen the number of people who vote reduce again and again and again, and very few young people vote. And I know Starmer wants to reduce the voting age to 16 so he thinks he'll be able to, gerrymander his way into office again. But I think he'll be surprised how few young people vote. Why would you vote? If you have a political class that never listens to you, that does stuff that's bad for you, why would you bother voting? Because you just look at them and go, well, nothing ever changes. And that's where we are as a nation. One of the reasons, that I think this has happened, one of the reasons we've had such constitutional turmoil in the UK, political turmoil in the last 10 years, is because the political class hasn't done what the people have told them to do. When the people voted to leave the EU in 2016, that was not just a vote to leave the EU. It was a vote to put British citizens first. It was a vote to re-establish our independence in the world, not just with the EU, our prosperity, etc. And they haven't done any of that. So we saw Theresa May go, then we saw Boris Johnson being booted out, and then we saw a massive reduction in people voting in the 2024 general election. Starmer got a huge majority, but on very few votes, on fewer votes than Corbyn got in 2019. And and now within a year of taking office, Starmer is now polling at 17, Labour Party is polling at 17%. This is a pox on all your houses by the electorate. So I completely understand why the youth don't wish to vote. There's nothing to vote for because they don't trust the system. But what I hope will happen with Advance UK is that we will bring serious principle politics back into the United Kingdom. We will say, as I'm sure you've heard me say in the past, Kendall, we will say precisely what it is we're going to do. We're not going to hoodwink the public. They may not like what we say we're going to do, in which case, don't vote for us. But we will be very serious and principled about what we say and do. And what we say is what we will do. And so they will know whether or not to vote for us. And I think if other political parties can behave in the same way, then we'll get re engagement with the youth, re engagement right across the electorate. And then I think that we have a much more vibrant, healthy political system.
I know you just touched on Keir Starmer and the 16, he wants 16-year-olds to vote. If that was a thing, and would you want mandatory, politics lessons maybe in schools so people are more educated on that fact?
Well, not with the educational system the way it is at the moment. They just use that as more indoctrination. Um,
Yeah.
no, I mean, I think it's wrong to reduce the voting age to
Yeah.
16. I think you have to. It's a really interesting point you made. You said, once you start paying bills, you've got to get into politics. Well, if you're 16 at school and you're not paying any bills, really, you're playing with politics. You're not your votes, your views don't have an impact on you. It's like having power but without responsibility. And so I think there is an argument to be made for people to be older when they vote, perhaps even 21, when you're
Hmm.
perhaps even older than 18. I know that in my own case, I wasn't really a mature adolescent until I got to around 21, but I was perhaps, immature compared to others, perhaps. Um, I think Starmer's going to be disappointed when he reduces the age to 16. I think he's not going to get the kind of vote share from the youth that he thinks he's going to get. The other thing that I think is happening, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, Kendall, because you're closer to it than I am, I think the youth are rebelling against the agenda that's being shoved down their throat. This critical race theory, DEI, being told that your forefathers were all slave traders, our history is something to be ashamed of. All of that, I think, is not washing with the youth. And I'm seeing increasingly younger people now coming to our kind of meetings, increasingly engaging with parties like Reform and Advance. And wanting change. And we're also seeing, I think, Christianity on the rise. This is all a pushback against people like Starmer. And I think he's going to be in for a bit of a surprise if he reduces the voting age to 16.
Mhm. I think a lot more people are kind of waking up to what's actually going on, especially within the youth. I think some people are already too far gone and indoctrinated to, have a conversation because sometimes when I try to have conversations, you get screamed at you're a racist,
But
people
tell
that don't
me,
even know.
but in your age group, how
Mhm.
many are now waking up, if you like, if that's not a patronizing term, waking up to the ills of Starmer's ideology, the ideology of the last 30 years, the Human Rights Act and DEI? How many are they waking up? Is there a greater number coming round?
Well, I've got friends who, are right. I've got friends who are left, all sides of the spectrum. We all get on, and the ones that were Labour supporters last year now are not. So I think there's definitely something happening. When I've spoken to people that left leaning and things, they're like, I don't like this Labour government. I don't like Keir Starmer. He's bad for the country. So I think people are waking up to what he's doing. Whether they're waking up to everything is a different question, but definitely to what the harm he's doing to the country. Yeah.
So let's hope they get engaged and discover, advance, and back up.
Uh, um, Sexual offences are up. With small boat arrivals, people not assimilating with our culture, with our values. Women aren't safe. Walking home at the streets at night. Um, what? what would be your proposal to kind of end or help violence against women and girls in this country?
There are two questions there, I think. The first is about ethnic minorities being predominantly the perpetrators of it, and also generally, how do you reduce violence against women? Um, I saw some, I can't remember the stats exactly, but I saw some horrific stats yesterday on how the vast majority, not vast majority, but a massive disproportionate number of sexual offences are caused by minority ethnicities in this country. And you know, we've got to be brave to call that out and call it out, because no amount of wishing not to offend that particular ethnic minority can justify allowing them not to be revealed, and therefore making our women vulnerable, our women and children vulnerable. Um, and that again goes back to so many of the things we've already discussed: ditching DEI, ditching progressive discrimination, making sure we have equality under the law, making sure the police know what they're meant to be doing, etc. Um, so I think we've discussed that to a significant extent already. But the other point that I think you touched on, which is very important and worth just driving home a bit, is that, one of the great things about this country is the way that did emancipate women, afforded women equal rights, brought them forward in the workplace, gave them equal opportunities. And that form of liberalism, which gave women equality, is now being used actually to damage women, to assault women. That liberalism, in my mind, has gone mad, and it's gone to a point now where, as we all know, you can identify as a woman if you're a man, even if you um, are biologically, completely, evidently a man, you still have all your tackle. Somehow you can claim that you're a woman, and some people would even entertain the idea of putting these people in women's prisons. But they perfectly accept, some of these people, they perfectly accept that trans women, they're actually men, should be allowed into women's toilets. They should be allowed to compete against women on the sports field, etc. And that is an assault on the equality afforded to women over 100 years of fighting to get that equality. It is actually an attack on women. And so we are turning our back on women in this country as a result of the ideologies that are being practiced. The other thing that I think is an assault on women is multiculturalism, because, we see now the same false liberal notion is used to justify women wearing the burqa. There can be no justification for women wearing the burqa in the United Kingdom. The burqa is the repression of women. It's an overt rejection of British culture. It's an overt rejection of the equality of man and woman as we understand it in the United Kingdom. And yet, those that claim that they're liberal say, well, women should be allowed to wear the burqa if they wish to. It's not about what women want. It's the fact that it is overtly a rejection of our culture and a repression of women. So the forces of liberalism, and I'll stop now, but the forces of, after I've said this, the forces of liberalism that gave freedom to women are now being used to actually restrict and damage women. We've got to go back to some common sense.
Um, Thank you for answering all my questions on all the topics there. Um, we're going to go to the questions from other people and, my peers, people I've spoken to that wanted to ask you a question specifically on what they think is important and what they wanted to ask you. So I've just picked a few. So the first question is from a young girl called Ashley who asked, "What makes you different from the Reform UK Party and the Conservative Party?"
So the Conservative Party has completely, certainly when they were in government, and I haven't seen much evidence of them having learnt their lesson, they have completely adopted Blairism. They've adopted the form of governance which Blair created, and which Cameron embraced so enthusiastically. So they are globalists. They believe in this unbridled, ridiculous form of liberalism that is actually now resulting in people not having civil liberty, women being damaged. They completely buy into this transgender nonsense. They were the ones responsible for mass migration, etc. The Conservatives are the Labour Party, but just not as bad. Um, that's basically the policies that the ideology, political philosophy, and policies they've been practicing. Reform, in its pursuit of power, is becoming the Conservative Party as the Conservative Party is. It's just another form of the Conservative Party. And if you don't believe me, all you need to do is look at the people that it's taking on into reform. They're all former Tories, and they're not even Tories who voted to leave the EU or Tories who stood against net zero or stood against, stood against the indoctrination of our children and control on freedom of speech and so on. They are taking into their bosom people who voted for lockdowns, people who voted for mandatory vaccines, people who voted for net zero, still believe in net zero. People, they took into their bosom the architect of the Online Harms Act, which is another attack on freedom of speech. They they are without a political philosophy. Reform is almost worse than the Conservative Party because in the pursuit of power, they've sacrificed all principle. And and taken on lots of Tories, but Farage will go this way or that way, depending on where he needs to go to try and get votes. And so, even though they pretend that they carry the torch of sovereignty, British sovereignty and independence, actually they don't. They will be a disaster in office.
Um, the next question, this one, I really like this question because it's very close to me. It was a question asked by Ravi, who said, "What would you do to help deprive schools and infrastructure in the Northeast?"
The answer, again, you and I have touched on, I think, in to some extent. Um, the answer comes from having a vibrant economy and having a country that is firing on all cylinders. So we've got to stop the de we've got to have economic prosperity. We can't have good education establishments without economic prosperity. Economic prosperity comes out of all the measures that you and I have just been discussing: lower taxes, lower welfare, creation of wealth, ditching net zero, having cheap energy, bringing back, imposing tariffs, bringing back production to the United Kingdom, making the Northeast. The Northeast used to be a fantastic producer of goods for a century, if not, for longer. And so we've got to have the ingredients for prosperity brought back to the United Kingdom. And then, as far as the schooling point is concerned, we've then also got to debug it in the way that you're very familiar with, Kendall, with all this indoctrination, etc. So it's, so many specific questions actually get the same answer. Does
Hmm.
that make sense? The same, different
Yeah.
questions about why isn't this working? Why isn't that working? Why isn't this working? How do we fix this? So much of it goes back to, getting rid of the Human Rights Act, getting rid of net zero, getting rid of progressive discrimination, these fundamental changes in the way that we think and behave as a country, those changes need to be made. And actually, then the country will actually largely automatically find its way right back to the right position.
Hmm. I think it was a good question because obviously the Northeast is kind of just left. No one really, touches on it,
Yeah.
especially not the government. So I can see where the concern
But can I say,
was there.
it's not just the Northeast. The Northeast is left. East End of London, Isleworth, Hounslow is left behind. So many parts of this country are now being overlooked. Uh, Granted, the Northeast is, but so many parts are being overlooked. Northern Ireland is completely overlooked. Large
Hmm.
parts of Wales are overlooked. It's because the country isn't properly functioning. The country needs to start functioning again. JD Vance said it brilliantly. He said, "You got to make something. You got to actually make something." We don't make anything anymore.
Um, the next question is from James, who asks, "What would be your policies on environmental protection, and where do you stand on that?"
So it depends on what he means by environmental protection. If he means stopping pollution,
Yeah.
stopping waste, plastic, all of that, absolutely agree with him. And can I just say, when I was a child, we had very little of that going on. We would. you reuse our milk bottles. We would reuse our Coca-Cola bottles. Everything was recycled. My parents were fastidious about recycling the little pops on our milk bottles because the milkman would come and pick those up as well. And we became a society of consumers, and discarders, use and throw away, use and throw away. Cars, when I was a child, if you had a dent in your car, you'd take it into the workshop and they'd bang the dent out and then they'd repaint it and they'd make it as good as they could. Now they just take the part of the side of the car off, throw it away, and put on a new part. We are a very wasteful society like that. And but you don't fix all of that by adopting self-harming policies like net zero. Net zero doesn't protect the environment. What net zero does is economically destroy the United Kingdom, and that cannot be good for anyone. The same people, by the way, who bang the drum for the environment are incessantly on their phones buying stuff from Amazon so that someone comes along with a cardboard box which goes straight in the bin. It's absurd. So we need joined up thinking on all of this.
Mhm. It's everyone speaks about, there's a problem, but they don't actually want to do anything about it. So I hope that answers this question. The next one's quite a big question, so brace yourself. Um, we know you want to deport every illegal migrant. Well, where do you stand on remigration and the fact that the indigenous white British people will become a minority in their own country in the next 30 years?
Yeah, so I think there's nothing offensive about remigration. Um, I don't advocate that any British citizens should be stripped of their citizenry. I think that's a very extreme step to take. But people who've been given indefinite leave to remain in this country shouldn't think that they have the right to remain here forever. And I think we do need positive policies now to encourage people who have different passports and are not British citizens actually to go home. Um, and a lot of people who've been given, I think everyone who's been given indefinite leave to remain under Starmer's government should have that removed. And an advanced UK government will have a complete suspension on foreigners being given indefinite leave to remain and foreigners being granted British citizenship. We will absolutely stop that in its tracks on our first day in government until we have settled the cultural and sort of the cultural makeup of the United Kingdom. We've got multiculturalism, which is causing real serious division in the country, and we need to stop making that worse immediately and then try and find a way back to a harmonious, settled culture. And we need to find a mechanism to do that peacefully and without taking um, drastic action. But I don't think there's anything drastic in saying to someone, you've lived here for a number of years, you were given indefinite leave to remain, but we'd be grateful if, under these conditions, if you'd agree to go home because we want to settle our own country. I think that's a perfectly reasonable position to take.
The argument I hear a lot is when you speak about, immigration and it's out of control. Obviously, I make the argument that legal migration is also out of control in
It
in
is.
my opinion. And argument I hear a lot is, well, we need them to do our jobs, and I think that it comes down to, the benefit system, people, the education system. We should be pushing our society to
Absolutely.
go into these jobs instead of having to get somebody else to come and do it for us. Um,
Absolutely.
and the last question is, in your opinion, what do you think the biggest problem is in Britain today?
Undoubtedly, it's immigration. Undoubtedly. We can find our way back economically. We can, or, you can have bad economic times, you can find your way back to good economic times. But if you cease to exist as a settled culture, you effectively cease to exist as a society. And if you cease to exist as a society, you cease to exist as a country. And if we go on doing what we're doing with mass migration, multiculturalism, progressive discrimination, um, destroying our connection with our past, trampling our connection with our past, our culture, our history, informing all British citizens. that actually the global good's more important than the national good, that if you are against immigration, you're racist, etc. If we completely trample our cultural settlement, as I call it, we will cease to exist. And so that is the most important thing to address.
Mm, totally agree. I just wanted to say a massive thank you for letting me interview you today, and taking the
Uh,
time out of your day to
Thank you,
do
Kendall.
that. So thank you for sitting and speaking to me about all these things.